Good afternoon. I'm Prabhatha Jela, Provost at Rensselaer, and it's a pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to the President's Commencement Colloquy. The Commencement Colloquy was organized by the President in 2003 to provide a forum for the Rensselaer community to gather at this formal event and to have a chance to have a dialogue with our honorands. So it is now my pleasure, and please join me in welcoming the host for today's colloquy, the 18th President of Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, Dr. Shirley Ann Jackson.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us. And I want to welcome everyone to this magnificent Curtis R. Prim Experimental Media and Performing Arts Center for the President's Commencement Colloquy. And I want to especially welcome any members of the remarkable class of 2022 and their loved ones who have joined us. Now, I have spoken often over the years about an underappreciated reality of a highly interconnected world. The fact that when there is a triggering event, we all are subject to intersecting vulnerabilities with cascading consequences. Indeed, as a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, I hope to be looking to study such domino effects as they relate to supply chains, climate change, multilateral institutions, and national security. The emergence of SARS-CoV-2 clearly is a great triggering event with cascading public health, social, economic, and geopolitical consequences. Globally, the pandemic is likely responsible for 15 million excess deaths in 2020 and 2021. In the United States, the pandemic revealed important weaknesses in our healthcare system, in our infrastructure for public health, and in our national politics. Less predictably, it also revealed that supply chains for key products and materials intended to be efficient and cost-saving could be insufficiently resilient in a crisis. In the early days of the pandemic, there were shortages of life-saving personal protective equipment, as well as shortages of swabs and reagents for COVID testing. As the pandemic shut down factories and fueled the demand for electronic devices, another key product, semiconductor chips, was in such short supply that auto manufacturers were forced to idle their factories. In the case of the world's most advanced chips, 92% are manufactured by a single business, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, an enormous vulnerability with potentially cascading consequences. With China insisting that Taiwanese reunification with the mainland is inevitable, our vulnerabilities here include potentially a great powers conflict and disruption to industries around the globe. The pandemic also clearly exacerbated the tensions between multilateralism and nationalism, with the world's wealthy nations initially slow to share their highly effective vaccines with the world's poorer nations, potentially fueling the rise of new variants. And with China reluctant to share information about COVID-19 and being insistent on the domestic use of its own, many people believe, less effective vaccines. Now, we see similar tensions between multilateral engagement and nationalistic priorities in the other great triggering event of this time, the war in Ukraine. The Russian economy is highly dependent on oil and natural gas, which in 2021 made up 45% of Russia's federal budget. This is especially exports. At the same time, the European Union, Germany most notably, is highly dependent on Russia for fossil fuels, a complicating factor as the world seeks to penalize Russia for overrunning its neighbor. Indeed, In the vulnerabilities created by this war, we are experiencing the aftershocks of another great triggering event, the 2011 earthquake and tsunami that resulted in the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster, which spurred Germany to immediately close its 8 oldest nuclear power plants, with the remaining set to close this year, increasing its dependency on Russian natural gas. And such triggering events are increasingly difficult to avoid in a world in which our challenges are both global and interlinked, including, of course, climate change and the related challenges of securing food, water, and energy supplies sufficient for a growing population. Human health and disease, national and global security, the intelligent allocation of crucial natural resources, and our need for sustainable infrastructure, materials, and systems. Yet at the same time, we are aware that the rapid advances in science, as exemplified by the work of one of our guests today, Dr. Francis Collins, at the International Human Genome Project, are reinforcing the preeminence of the United States in the fields of technology and life sciences, making it clear that our nation will continue to set the global agenda when it comes to research and development in the biomedical sciences. Now, we as a nation find ourselves precariously balanced between these two cycles, one waxing, one waning. And many questions come to mind. Does our unique vantage point give us new perspective on what it means to be a powerful nation? What positive opportunities for growth and change do we currently face, and how do we harness in holistic and efficient ways the nation's deep reservoir of intellectual, technological, scientific, industrial, and human assets to solve today's most pressing problems? What lessons can we draw from our current political situations at home and abroad to apply to our scientific trajectory? In what ways does politics influence science or limit its progress? And do scientific advances even recognize national borders? Now, I have tried, as I've gone through my career, to use my background in physics to help navigate such questions, and they inform how I think about these things and how I question our guests. As a physicist, one develops an ability to look at systems that seem to be chaotic, not merely to impose order, but to understand their complexity, and then to use this understanding to figure a way to manage through complex issues. Physicists see beyond individual phenomena and try to discover the principles that are both explanatory and predictive. And such an approach is valuable to problems that are not merely measurable in light years or Planck lengths, but those on a societal or global scale as well. And we are so fortunate to have with us today 2 such distinguished honorands, both truly national treasures, to help us better understand and manage through these chaotic times by sharing their knowledge and experience with the Rensselaer community. We are so delighted to have brought these 2 leaders here today who have in their careers successfully addressed multifaceted problems of great global import. And so this afternoon, we will discuss intersecting vulnerabilities with cascading consequences with them. And we will hear their thoughts on managing risks that potentiate other risks. And then tomorrow, we will award them honorary degrees. Now, before I introduce them, I would like to recognize a great friend of Rensselaer, our own Congressman Paul Tonko from the 20th Congressional District. Congressman, would you stand and be recognized, please? So please allow me now to introduce our guests. Our first guest has served as president of the Council on Foreign Relations for the past 19 years, after a distinguished career in public service. From 2001 to 2003, he was Director of Policy Planning for the U.S. Department of State and served as a principal advisor to Secretary of State Colin Powell. Confirmed by the U.S. Senate to hold the rank of ambassador, he also served as U.S. coordinator for policy toward the future of Afghanistan and the U.S. envoy to the Northern Ireland peace process. In 2013, he returned to Northern Ireland to chair the multi-party negotiations that provided the foundation for the 2014 Stormont House Agreement. For his efforts to promote peace and conflict resolution, he received the 2013 Tipperary International Peace Award. From 1989 to 1993, our honorand was Special Assistant to President George H.W. Bush and Senior Director for Near East and Southern Asian Affairs on the staff of the National Security Council. In 1991, he was awarded the Presidential Citizens Medal for his contributions to U.S. policy during Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm. A Rhodes Scholar, he holds a bachelor's degree from Oberlin College and his master's and doctoral degrees from Oxford University. He has been a member of the faculty of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University and of Hamilton College. Our guest is the author or editor of 14 books on American foreign policy and 1 book on management. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador Richard Haass. Our second honorand currently serves as the acting science advisor to President Joe Biden and co-chair of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. He previously served as the 16th director of the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, appointed by President Barack Obama and confirmed by the United States Senate in 2009. He remained in this role for 12 years until last December, overseeing the largest supporter of biomedical research in the world and serving an unprecedented 3 administrations. One of the world's foremost genetics researchers, our honorand also maintains his long-standing position as a senior investigator at the National Human Genome Research Institute, pursuing genomics research on type 2 diabetes and a rare disorder of premature aging called progeria. He is responsible for landmark discoveries of the genes responsible for diseases that include cystic fibrosis, Huntington's disease, neurofibromatosis, and the M4 type of adult acute leukemia. From 1993 to 2008, he led the National Human Genome Research Institute and the International Human Genome Project, which culminated in April of 2003 with the completion of a finished genome sequence of the human genome. Now, our guest earned his Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry at the University of Virginia, his doctorate in physical chemistry at Yale University, and his MD degree at the University of North Carolina School of Medicine. In 2007, President George W. Bush awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom. In 2009, President Barack Obama awarded him the National Medal of Science. Please join me in welcoming the Honorable Francis Collins. Good afternoon. So let us begin. We should begin our discussion at what has been confronting us directly for almost 3 years, namely the global COVID-19 pandemic. So Dr. Collins and Ambassador Haas, first of all, thank you for joining us, and thank you for joining us. You know, pandemics are by definition global events. And so, given that, here's my first simple question. Has the world's response been sufficiently multilateral?
President Jackson, you're not going to throw easy ones at us, are you? No softballs in this stadium. All right, let's get to it. Let me just say, it's a privilege to be here as part of this colloquy and to be part of your commencement and to be honored in the way that I guess is planned for some ceremony tomorrow morning. So thank you. President Jackson and I have been friends for many years, but I've not had the chance to be in this beautiful space. So it really is a privilege for my wife Diane and me to join you here. What kind of report card would we give to the world's response to SARS-CoV-2? First, let me say, as a scientist, the science response to this pandemic, this coronavirus emerging out of Wuhan, China, in the last days of 2019, has been nothing short of amazing, pulling together the best and brightest minds in the academic world, in government, in the industry, coming together with an organized effort so that no stone was unturned as far as possibilities of developing a vaccine. And it worked. And in 11 months, which is about 5 times faster than has ever happened before, we had mRNA vaccines with 95% efficacy and an extremely good safety record. And that outstripped almost everybody's expectations, certainly mine, although I was 24/7 engaged in it all that time. So that was a positive part of this. In terms of how we as the world responded to it, certainly no A-pluses there. There's some pretty dark moments. First of all, here in the United States, we made, I think, some kind of difficult situation worse by mixing together politics and public health in a way that caused a great deal of confusion amongst good, honorable people about what exactly the message was. We had the oftentimes disruptive influence of social media, spreading information that was creating fear and misunderstanding and causing people to doubt the facts that were in front of them. And so here we are, probably the darkest part of this report card, with 319,000 people in the United States of America who lost their lives since last June unnecessarily because they were not convinced that a vaccine was something they would want to take. 319,000 gravestones. That should have never happened, and yet that's an indictment of just how divisive, how mixed up our ability is to share reliable public health information. I will not say our public health response was perfect either. There were mistakes made. We had difficulties with getting our diagnostic testing up and going, although now it's in pretty good place. It certainly wasn't at first. And therapeutics, although we worked really hard to find them, it took a while because the science requires you to go through a lot of steps that you can't just go through overnight. Globally, because I think you're asking not just about the United States of America, we did, I think, an imperfect, to put it mildly, job in terms of sharing the capabilities that were developed in the developed world to help those that were still waiting, and that inequity remains very serious. Although the United States has donated more vaccine doses than the rest of the world combined, it has still left a very small proportion of other countries in a good space to take advantage of those. The other thing we did export was our misinformation. So now in many African countries where they do now have vaccines, people are questioning whether they should take them because they've heard that people in the US are making a case that these maybe aren't safe after all. So yeah, talk about a triggering event that exposed a lot of other difficulties. It's just sort of the bad combination of a public health emergency, the worst pandemic in more than 100 years, landing in the middle of the most divisive environment that most of us can ever imagine in terms of who do you trust and who do you believe?
Well, as you know, there has been some dissatisfaction, from the perspective that Moderna, many feel, that received tremendous U.S. government support, including collaborating with the NIH to design the vaccine, that, it was putting its own commercial interests above giving poor nations access. Is that fair?
I should probably not comment upon that in this present audience because there happen to be some legal events underway.
So I'm going to give you a break then.
Thank you for that.
And so what would you say about the multilateral response to the pandemic?
First of all, it's great it's an honor to be with both of you and to be on this campus. So thank you.
You're welcome.
In terms of the multilateral response, I would not give it high marks. Beginning with the failure of China to meet its international obligations under the international health regulations, and it highlighted the gap between our international machinery, the World Health Organization, and individual countries. And it's part of a much larger phenomenon where sovereignty is the basic building block of international relations. And we're seeing in Ukraine what happens when sovereignty is violated. But also sovereignty at times can be an impediment to the sort of international cooperation we need. In the case of China, hiding behind sovereignty and frustrating at every turn a comprehensive, impartial investigation of what actually happened in Wuhan. And there's still big questions. So from the beginning, there's been an imperfect, inadequate international response. And as Francis was saying, in this country, we had an excess of supply over demand. In much of the world, it was the reverse. And I don't think we stepped up. And the fact that still such a significant percentage of the world has not been vaccinated, in large part because of a lack of supply, is a real indictment. Even worse, this was COVID-19. At some point, we're going to have COVID-24 or COVID-26 or some other infectious disease. What worries me, and it's really frustrating, is I don't see that the machinery has absorbed and implemented all the lessons, so next time around we're going to give higher marks. Not clear to me. So in virtually every aspect of what I do for a living, foreign policy or international relations, there's a gap between the scale of the challenge and the scale of the institutional response. And institutional responses are always a function of institutional capability and national will. And we see it here. This is a powerful case study. But I do want to circle back to one thing Francis said, which is it also shows, technology also often gets a bum rap. And here, imagine what this crisis would have been like had we not had Zoom and internet in order to conduct everything from education to business to personal communications, or if we hadn't had these vaccines. We're talking about excess deaths on the order of 15 to 20 million. It would have been many, many times incalculable, the human and economic cost, if these twin technologies, the digital technologies and the vaccine technologies didn't exist. So it also, and I think I'd say it's probably true of other areas as well. If I were going to make a prediction here, my bold prediction of the day is I'm not very optimistic about what people in my business are going to do to deal with the challenges of climate change. I actually believe if there's a chance we're going to narrow the gap between the challenge and the response, it's going to come through technology much more than through diplomacy.
Well, I think ultimately we're going to need to talk this afternoon about what these digital technologies mean and is the current multilateral framework that exists up to the task. And so just hold that, because I do want to talk about the promise of the technology, because within days, Francis, of Chinese scientists posting the SARS-CoV-2 genome, the sequence to an international database, your team at the NIH Vaccine Research Center determined what the structure of an mRNA vaccine should be, and just 11 months later, Moderna rolled out its vaccine. And in a fraction of the time that it takes to develop most vaccines. What does this tell us about potentially speeding other biomedical advances? And can you also tell us a little bit about the Advanced Research Project Agency for Health?
Oh, I'd love to.
And how that might play into this.
Sure. So, first of all, one needs to recognize that mRNA vaccines didn't just pop up in somebody's mind on January 10th, 2020, when the sequence was posted by the Chinese. There had been 25 years of working on how you might be able to use this particular nucleic acid, the messenger RNA, as a means of immunizing somebody against a protein that you wanted them to be able to develop immunity, so that if that protein appeared in the form of a virus, your body would be ready for it. And it's an elegant idea, but it had all kinds of problems along the way. And ultimately, two investigators, Katalin Karikó and Drew Weissman, came up with a way that you could do this and get the response that you would want to from the body, as opposed to just an inflammatory, get rid of this thing as quick as you can kind of approach. And that built over time, and a guy named Barney Graham at NIH was working on mRNA vaccines for other coronaviruses. Remember SARS? Remember MERS? Well, those are family members of SARS-CoV-2. And he was working particularly on MERS. And he'd already figured out some really important things about that spike protein that sits on the surface of the virus, which is the first thing your immune system sees, and how you could use that as your target for a vaccine. And it was pretty tricky. You had to understand some structural biology as well as immunology in order for this to work. So he was ready. And when that sequence appeared, it was less than 48 hours to design what ultimately became the Moderna vaccine. That was pretty amazing. But again, remember all that you were having to stand on the shoulders of other people to get there. That's always the way it's going to be in biomedical research, which is why we always need to be giving every kind of support we can to basic science that doesn't necessarily have a direct line to some clinical benefit, but who knows what might happen a few years later. That's the foundation of virtually everything. ARPA-H, you asked about, is the new kid on the block in terms of biomedical research within the Department of Health and Human Services. You've heard of DARPA, many of you have, so this is a part of the Department of Defense, which has been there for many decades and has done a few interesting things, like starting the internet, for instance. DARPA is also credited pretty much with coming up with the GPS system, that without which I never would have got here today driving from Maryland. And a few other interesting things too. Now they've had some pretty big failures because they're a part of the science enterprise that likes to take risks, sometimes really big risks, and put money into something knowing that it might fail. But if it succeeds, that'll be transformational. Now, DARPA has one customer, the Department of Defense. And so they do a lot of things about warfighter support and even weapons. But why not have a version of that that's focused on health? That's been the argument. President Biden was basically campaigning for that even before he got elected. And now that he's the president, he wants to see that happen. And for me now, being his acting science advisor, that's job number one. Collins, get ARPA-H and get it going. So it's going. It got appropriated by the Congress, thank you Congress, back in March with $1 billion. We are in the midst of hiring a director who's going to bring the same kind of culture of risk-taking and entrepreneurial approach and being pretty darned autonomous, not in the same space of peer review that you will see in most traditional science support, being willing to take risks and move fast. But it's going to try to identify these special areas that you might call translational research, where there is some exciting science that's happening and you can kind of see how it's going to get to the clinic and break things wide open. But it's going to take a long time, and you're going to need some partners that are not the traditional academic institutions, maybe a small business over here, an artificial intelligence group over there, and you program managers bring that together and turn it into a project that otherwise just wouldn't happen. That's what ARPA-H is going to do. I'm pretty excited about seeing how that plays out. An example, Here we've got mRNA vaccines. They work for infectious disease. Would they work for cancer? Well, you know, let's find out. And we can find that out over many years in the traditional way, or we could have an ARPA-H program that basically goes after this to see, initially probably with animal models, and then could we actually immunize all of you against the common cancers? After all, there's about 50 different common mutations that happen in oncoproteins that are associated with things like pancreatic cancer or breast cancer or colon cancer. Why don't we just immunize everybody against those mutations even before they have any hint of any problem? And then your immune system is primed and ready to start looking if something's popping up. I think that's an interesting idea, but it would take a long time to get there without this kind of bold new enterprise.
Well, maybe it also, requires a little gene editing.
It might.
Here, we operate from a fundamental belief that engineering, the physical, and computational sciences play an important role.
You don't have to convince me. I'm absolutely with you.
And so I do want to give a plug for the lipid nanoparticles. And
I'm a big fan of those too, especially if you could target them to a particular part of the body where you want to deliver a drug or maybe a gene editor that's going to fix something. I gave a talk this week about a lipid nanoparticle that seems to target hematopoietic stem cells in the bone marrow. If you want to cure sickle cell disease in an in vivo strategy where you don't have to take the bone marrow out and treat it, you just treat it right there in that patient, those lipid nanoparticles are looking pretty good.
so I just want to point out that that's a little chemistry, chemical engineering, et cetera. So Richard, back to China and this whole issue of global geopolitics. Has China's response to the pandemic changed the world's view of an ascendant China? I mean, what would you say to that?
Well, I'm glad you did not ask me about lipid nanoparticles.
And
Well, I
I'm glad
was,
you didn't ask me
but-
about China.
I want to thank you for wait, it took about 2 minutes to feel truly inadequate sitting here. I knew we'd get there. I just didn't expect to get there so quickly. But here we are. It didn't take place in a vacuum. That's the honest answer. There had already been growing doubts about China, particularly Xi Jinping's China, which does represent something of a departure. It's much more repressive, centralized politically at home. We saw what happened in Hong Kong. We've seen what happened to the Uyghur Muslim minority. Economically, the Deng Xiaoping reforms, the hope that the state-owned enterprises would gradually be dialed back, you'd have greater economic freedom, that's been reversed. All the promises China made about the South China Sea, we're never going to militarize islands and so forth. Well, guess what? They did exactly what they said they wouldn't do. One looks at their behavior on their border with India. One looks at their behavior vis-a-vis Japan. One looks at the pressures on Taiwan. So there was already something of a reassessment, I would say, and almost a disillusionment. Indeed, one of the really interesting conversations in my field over the last year or two has been whether we got wrong the approach to China that's largely informed U.S. foreign policy for 2 decades now. Essentially, the idea was to integrate China into global institutions, bring them into the World Trade Organization and the rest. And the argument was, if we do that, it will reinforce or even accelerate moderating and reforming trends in China, politically and economically. And what happened was China came in, but then it cherry-picked those aspects of globalization it wanted, put aside the rest, and again, it had none of those predicted positive effects, and it's actually led to something of a real rethinking about certain types of foreign policy. But no, I'd say, and also now what's going on, China, after all the initial, not just, I mentioned a second ago, not cooperating with the WHO, never owning up to what happened. Its vaccine, as I think you mentioned already, has, shall we say, been less than wildly successful. Then you have the whole lockdown approach. And right now, China hasn't quite figured out a trajectory for for moving into a post-COVID or even a contending it, but making the problem manageable. And so I think all of this has further taken a bit of the gloss off. China's early February no limits declaration with Russia on the eve of Russia's unprovoked war of choice with Ukraine hasn't helped. So no, I think there's a profound disillusionment, and in some ways the political military market is reflecting that. Look at in the last couple of years, you've had the growth, the emergence of the Quad. This weekend, the president's in South Korea as we speak today. He's off to Japan next. In Japan, he'll be meeting with the leadership of Japan, Australia, South Korea. You've also had the AUKUS innovation, another multilateral grouping. And what this shows is the countries of the region are coming together to contend with, to deter, or if necessarily, defend against what they see as a greater China threat. In Europe, much more willingness to sign up to certain types of technology limits on China. So no, I think one of the interesting things of Russian and Chinese foreign policy, and there's a historical pattern here, is these major powers act in ways that cause their neighbors to come together, and then the major powers cry encirclement. And they basically say, we're the victim, rather than seeing themselves in many ways as the factor that has actually caused other countries to join forces. And I think that's what's happening with China.
So the kinds of discussions that are occurring now about China and China's alignment with Russia in the current conflict, raises a broader set of questions about great powers tensions. And you were in the administration of President George W. Bush, and when you were there, you characterized you have characterized the first Gulf War as a war of necessity, and the second a war of choice. Can you talk a little bit about how President Putin's war of choice in Ukraine is reshaping the world order?
Yeah. Just for those of you, the very few of you who haven't read my book on it, or haven't read Maimonides, who turned out about 1,000 years before I thought of this, he already had thought of it. The idea that certain wars are wars of necessity, where you have a vital national interest at stake and no alternative tools to protect them or promote them. Wars of choice tend to be wars where either you have less than vital interests or you do have alternative tools. And I would simply say the pressure on decision makers to embark on wars of choice is much greater simply because they're discretionary. So you've got to justify ultimately the benefits against the economic or diplomatic or human costs of doing so. President Putin embarked on a war of choice. He didn't have to do what he did when he did it. I think, and I'm actually going to talk about it tomorrow, I think he did it on a basis of various calculations, all of which were perfectly rational and all of which were perfectly wrong about how the war would likely unfold and essentially the projected costs and benefits of invading Ukraine. And he got virtually every assessment wrong. And he is paying, and his country is paying, an enormous price for it. I mean, Russia's going to emerge from this fundamentally weaker. First of all, exposed. It's weaker reputationally, not simply because of the unprovoked aggression. We didn't think great things about Russia before this, but we did have a sense of what we thought was Russia's military capability. Yeah. And it's interesting that the idea of a Potemkin village, in this case a Potemkin military, that Russia's military has been exposed as being quite poor in quality. And it's actually it's an interesting lesson because it's not simply that their hardware is disappointing, it's their software, and above all, their human software. The lack of quality leadership through the chain of command. And also the lack of morale. The Ukrainians know what they're fighting for, the Russians don't. And I think all of this, so Russia's reputation is much damaged and diminished. The sanctions are profound. And even though they're incomplete, largely because of the gas sanctions, they are still, ultimately, if they stay in place, will have a tremendous impact on the Russian economy. And even now, they're having a large impact, even if the net resources still reaching Russia is high. But sectorally, they're having a profound impact. Russia's become a pariah. And some of the best young Russians are leaving or have left or are not going home. And they will essentially hemorrhage their future. So Russia now is a country of what, 140 million people? You talked before about excess deaths. It's had a terrible COVID experience. The Russian statistics are a lie because the government couldn't fess up to the truth. But Russia's become one of the great underachieving countries in the world. It's got limited dimensionality, essentially energy, military force, even their cyber capabilities. Let me put it this way, if they still exist, they haven't been manifested in a particularly significant way. So, and then they've brought about the strengthening of NATO, greater cohesion, the expansion of NATO. So in the old days, I'll just end with this. In the old days, the Soviets, back in the Cold War, had this concept, which I find really useful still, and it was called the correlation of forces. And it was an assessment of the balance in the world, not just hardware versus hardware, but all these other factors that affect national will, from willingness to use capabilities, national cohesion, and so forth. And there's both a static measure and a dynamic measure. And I would say the correlation of forces has moved dramatically against Russia as a result of this war of choice. I'd even go so far as to say the day will come that Vladimir Putin will no longer be in office. I don't know if it will be for natural or unnatural causes. And there will be a successor, maybe not his immediate successor, but I would predict, like just as Khrushchev came after Stalin and denounced him, the day will come when Vladimir Putin will be denounced and vilified in Russia as the man who did lasting damage to his country.
So let me make a switch here, Francis, but it actually in its way relates. You know, President Bill Clinton was in office during much of the work on the Human Genome Project.
Yes, he was.
And apparently he clearly was very moved by the endeavor, and apparently based on it, there were warring parties in the former Yugoslavia. I don't know if you remember that.
I do.
And so President Clinton warned Yugoslavia of what he called the irrationality of their ethnic wars. Can you tell us a little bit about the lessons that our genome holds for geopolitics coming out of this question of what was happening in Yugoslavia at the time?
President Clinton was very much enamored of the Genome Project and what it might teach us about ourselves. He was voracious in his interest in learning about the details. And as it became more and more clear from reading out our own DNA instruction book, just how similar we all are to each other. If you talk about the well-behaved part of the genome that includes the parts that's coding for proteins, 99.9% of my DNA is the same as yours. And it wouldn't matter which one of you I picked or where your ancestors came from. It became really clear, therefore, that we are all really one part of a single family, all descended from a common pool. And anybody who's trying to use those sorts of ethnic differences and claim that they're biologically based and somebody's superior and somebody else is inferior is absolutely in violation of the facts. And Bill Clinton loved that. And yes, he did lecture the Serbs and the Croats in Kosovo. You all should not be fighting each other. Your DNA is 99.9% the same. I'm not sure how they took that or whether it changed the course.
I think we know how they took that.
of the bad things that were happening. But he was absolutely right. And we should keep remembering that in a larger way as well, because we are facing, of course, continual ways in which people figure out how to imagine that they are superior from their group to some other group. And certainly here in the United States, as we have more of an awareness after the murder of George Floyd of the structural racism that has infected so many of the activities in our country for our entire history, there are still people out there who base that upon some idea about biological inferiority, and they are absolutely wrong. And they can't depend upon science to back up that kind of bigotry and prejudice. And we should keep saying that.
You know, years ago, when I was chairman of the NRC, I had occasion to meet Angela Merkel when she was the environment minister. This was not that long after the breakup of the former Soviet Union. And it was clear then that she was not exactly a fan of nuclear power. and so we all know about Germany's dependence upon natural gas especially, but oil and natural gas, and where it comes from. And because of that, Germany has been, or at least it was being accused of financing Putin's war machine. And you know, the belief is that moral standards tend to go by the wayside when one's economy is at risk. And so, you know, the transition to clean energy is not likely to change in the short term the dilemma of dependency. And because, for example, China now dominates the supply chain for lithium-ion batteries. So I think there's this whole kind of way we look at things where we want simple answers. And yet we haven't been paying attention to what goes on in the large. You know, I, as you all have, you know, participated in sessions at Davos and spent time talking about the Belt and Road Initiative of China. And I don't think many folks here all the time really think deeply about how much that has, you know, whether it's successful or failing, there's some vulnerabilities there. But how do you see the world evolving? And I'm asking both of you this question about, you know, what does nationalism really mean when we're dependent for natural resources on the one hand, and frankly, knowledge and technology on the other, dependent on each other. And so what's going to come of all this nationalism versus, you know, a more multilateral approach? And so, Francis, maybe I'll start with you.
Sure. I think it was Louis Pasteur who said, "Science knows no single country. It's the torch that illuminates the world." And that has to be right. Science is, by its very nature, an international enterprise. The Human Genome Project would never have been successful if it had not involved the talents of all those 2,400 scientists in 6 countries who put their shoulders to the same wheel and agreed to give all the data away as soon as it had been generated as a wonderful model of what international science should look like. And I might say that was all done by sort of voluntary decisions by scientists without a whole lot of help from ministers of finance, because I'm not sure it would have gone so smoothly otherwise. Just got to say that. So, and I think science continues, for the most part, to be this kind of an international effort. All through COVID, the interactions that I had as the director of NIH with colleagues in Europe and Asia were intense, and sharing of information almost immediately. Because Pasteur is right, we need the torch to illuminate the whole world. In that case, it was the best hope we had of dealing with this pandemic pathogen. But there are ways, of course, that gets interfered with. The trends that we see now, and here's where Richard can speak much more eloquently than I can about the trends towards nationalism, which has certainly also afflicted our own country in the not so distant past, has really gotten in the way of that and cannot possibly lead to a good outcome if what we're trying to see is not just other people flourishing, but ourselves as well. This is the way in which we make progress. And the way in which that has turned into some kind of a perceived threat puzzles me greatly from the perspective of science. Progress always seems to be enhanced by figuring out who's got the talent. Let's figure out a collaboration. Let's figure out the deal about exactly who's going to do what and how we're going to make the data available, and then let's go there. That's what we're doing across the board in medical research.
So those are knowledge resources, but then we have energy and other natural resources.
So
Talk to us a little bit about that.
I'll get to energy in about 1 minute.
All right, you're going to talk about technology?
A little bit. I wanted to try to set the table, because it's one of the truly curious things about this moment in history. And here we've been talking about a pandemic that began in Wuhan. We haven't talked about climate change, but I expect we will at some point. All of these are manifestations of globalization. Yet, and the argument would be that the best way to deal with global challenges is collective action. Right. One of the most common phrases in the field is international community. The problem is there isn't one. And nationalism and deglobalization are quite powerful forces. And we're seeing the manifestation everywhere in terms of, for example, trade. The World Trade Organization, for the most part, doesn't make much difference anymore. It's because, and more broadly, anything that looks like the UN General Assembly doesn't make much of a difference, because 192 or so countries can't agree on anything. Turns out even the Security Council can't agree on things, but we'll put that aside for a moment. But the trend is it's not unilateralism, because unilateralism tends to be unsuccessful, but it's much smaller, more boutique or tailored forms of multilateralism. So in virtually every domain of international relations now, you find groupings of the like-minded, the relevant, and that's the way there's going to be international effort or progress, much more than if it's all or nothing, it'll be nothing, to be blunt. Energy is really interesting. Certain energy, well, you mentioned Angela Merkel before I get to that. Her legacy will be hurt in two. One is the anti-nuclear move in Germany, however understandable it was after Fukushima, was short-sighted. I mean, if you care about climate change, nuclear ought to be one of your priorities in terms of it doesn't contribute to climate change. And in this, by the way, you're the expert on it, but our own country's lack of investment and lack of political readiness to field a large number of next-generation reactors, again, I think makes very little sense, given our energy requirements and given our commitment to doing something on climate change. What's so interesting also about the German situation, I'll just, again, it's one of these curious things in my field, is that the whole argument, and it's been around for over 100 years, closer to 200 years, that interdependence would be a force for peace. That if we were all dependent on one another for whether it was energy or anything else, none of us would have an incentive to disrupt these economic relations, therefore we'd avoid war. Well, one, it didn't work, didn't prevent World War I the last I checked, but even now, in terms of Russia, what we see are these interdependencies can very much work in favor of one side. And in this case, it's fueled aggression. So again, it's one of these interesting areas where the field, I think, needs to rethink. In terms of energy right now, one is much more interest in energy security than there was 6 months ago. And the challenge is going to be, how do we balance concerns about energy security with concerns about climate? How do we get this balance right? And because there was too much, I think, too little of an interest in energy security. And I think now the question is, again, how do we get this balance right? We don't want to go to the other extreme where suddenly we start firing up every coal plant we can think of simply because we have short-term energy needs. But it will take years. I mean, we're talking about renewables to scale up. You mentioned nuclear is going to take a long time. Take Germany. Germany, 40–45% of its gas comes from Russia. In order to basically move Germany away from that, in the short run, you could do things like tariffs to reduce demand. But fundamental changes are going to come essentially either from alternative energy substituting or from alternative sources of gas, and that would probably mean liquefied natural gas. That would mean we here need to produce more. We need to have terminals so we can, after it's liquefied, we can put it on ships, get it to Europe. They then have to have terminals to receive it. They will then need new pipelines. We're talking 2 to 3 years if this is done, if you will, the kind of rates you were talking about with vaccines. We're talking about many years, and we don't have many years if one looks at the intensity of this war. Because right now, because of higher energy prices, even though Mr. Putin is exporting less volume of energy, his proceeds are up, simply because of the multiplication, smaller numbers, but times larger price.
Well, in many ways, you just described a classic case of intersecting vulnerabilities. Because if we're trying to deal with the issues of climate change, but there's a conflict that looks at and disrupts dependence on natural gas, oil, then one has to deal with what replaces it. And none of these problems are short-term problems, with what Francis talked about. And the question, I guess, I would have is, are there lessons that we can take from the development of the COVID-19 vaccines and the manufacturing of them, which one could say came out of two things. One, you already pointed out, 20, 25 years worth of research that played into it. And so the need to have an outlook for long-term investment on the one hand, but secondly, de facto, a kind of government subsidy on the other to rapidly develop the vaccines. You want to make a few comments there?
What was done for the vaccines was very much of that sort, recognizing the critical nature of moving this forward as quickly as possible. The Operation Warp Speed, which was sort of an unfortunate name, but it was intended to create this sense that we are going to move at an unprecedented pace. That involved a great deal of government investment in risky endeavors, basically making sure that manufacturing got started on a vaccine even before you knew if it was going to work, because you didn't want to come to the end of your definitive trial and say, hooray, it works. Oh, it's going to be 6 months before we have any doses for anybody. So that was set up ahead of time. That was a very successful enterprise. It's the kind of thing that we should think about in situations of that sort. It was unique because people were dying and you didn't want to have a day go by where you could have potentially been further along. And a lot of us spent a lot of time trying to make sure that those days didn't go by without that attention. When it comes to energy, renewable energy, do we have that same kind of mentality? No, I don't think we do. I think there's certainly, Richard said something a bit ago that I'm probably going to have to agree with, that the solution to the climate crisis is probably more likely to come from technology than from diplomacy or political decisions, because we have not done so well with those so far in terms, there's a lot of diagnoses of the problem and not much in the way of political action to address it. We just had a big meeting. I'm now the co-chair of the President's Council Advisors on Science and Technology, as you mentioned, and a big interest here in terms of fusion energy. And will we actually get that to work in a decadal plan? That means 10 years. And the cynics will say, we've been saying that fusion energy is 10 years away for the last 40 years. But maybe eventually it'll be right. And there have been at least a couple of experiments now which actually for a few seconds did seem to be able to achieve energy production. Not quite as much as was put into the experiment, but getting close. And most of us think in the next year or so there will be a success there of a modest amount of energy produced by fusion and some reactor, maybe not ITER, maybe something else. That would be one of those things that would be such a groundbreaking change. And that deserves, in my view, every kind of investment of energy and smarts. And I hope there's some people in this room that will figure out how to make this work.
They will.
Because the promise, you know, if a star can do it, why can't we?
Yeah. So we talk about solutions to climate change. So we need to kind of go there.
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Yeah, of course.
One of the words I've almost banned at the Council on Foreign Relations is the word solutions. I actually say there's very few things I've come to conclude that are problems for which there's solutions. I think if we're lucky, there's conditions that can be managed. And I would put climate change probably more there. But now I've just interrupted and disagreed with the president of the Institute.
No, that's okay.
So I've enjoyed being here this week. And,
That honorary degree, maybe not so much.
Yeah, maybe not so much.
Be an empty chair tomorrow morning.
No, actually,
but we'll all know
we
why.
don't disagree. The difference is that if you're doing engineering, you do try to solve a problem. Mm-hmm. It may be a problem that's on the pathway to something, mm-hmm. but you do try to solve a problem because it focuses what you do.
Well said.
Okay. And so
I love that. What the social sciences can learn from the physical sciences. I love it.
But the real point is, I'm sorry, but you want
I was going to say and vice versa, so.
exactly. And so here's the thing that I think, and it's hard to talk about, but you mentioned nuclear, and so certainly I think nuclear has a role to play and should be part of the energy mix. But the one thing I did learn with both research I did, but also as being NRC chair, is that it's not just that you pop up and now you're having energy generation that is relatively carbon free. There are little things called fuel bundles, control rods, the civil infrastructure, which is heavily uses concrete, which by the way generates a lot of greenhouse gases. And so one has to look at the complete, fuel cycle and what it takes to get to where, one is. And so as a country, except when faced with this kind of imminent emergency that we were with COVID-19, people have anathema, they feel it's anathema to talk about longer range planning on things. And so I'll just give you a factoid, but I'm giving you another book to write.
Just what I need.
So do you know where most of our nuclear fuel comes from in this country?
I mean,
Just take a guess.
where the uranium comes from?
Yeah. And the fuel.
No.
No. Kazakhstan. And the actual fabrication, a lot of it for our current plants, is by a company called Urenco.
That I knew.
And Urenco is a company that emanates from, speaking to the microphone.
Uranium, isn't that from Brussels?
No, it's actually Germany.
Germany? Well, close.
So now
I was in the right continent.
Germany
Yeah, so-
facing its issues relative to its energy supplies.
Right.
So that's the kind of thing we have to think through. And, what are the things that can occur in a multilateral space, as well as our own policies that could help with that? And are there things we can learn from what we've done in the biomedical arena? So I'm giving these guys a hard time because, I'm supposed to go through these questions, but you all know how I am.
Are we going to get graded at the end?
Yeah.
I hope you're as generous as a Harvard professor. Look, I think in climate, I find it useful to think about three different buckets, and then it directly ties to what you were just saying. There's all the efforts on mitigation, which are coming up short. Yeah. There's all the ideas about adaptation. How do you essentially adjust to climate change that's happened or is inevitable? It's already baked into the cake. And then there's the question of reversal. What can you do in that? Basically two areas there, carbon capture and particles that reflect light. And a lot of research going on, although not enough on the last. It's so it's politically controversial, and too many people see it as a cop-out, almost a sign of a lack of commitment to mitigation when it's not. I think it's actually a compliment. But one of the big issues, and it actually gets at something Francis is an expert on, is going to be when we come up with technologies that actually are useful, either in the first of these buckets, which is mitigation, which is the biggest emphasis, or reversal technology, carbon capture or solar reflection. The question is going to be, is it a global public good or not? And I think of some of the debates about HIV/AIDS vaccines. I think of some of the stuff we've had more recently. So just say a company in the United States, with or without government subsidy, comes up with something better on battery or something on nuclear or something on what have you. And then the question is, if we want to encourage other countries around the world, say India, which will soon be the world's most populous country, only $2,000 GDP per capita. Well, if India is going to go up that ramp, think about the climate implications of that. China, for example, now is roughly 5 times that level per capita. We obviously want India to get there. We just would like them to get there on a responsible route in terms of carbon. And the question is, how do we make available technologies that could and would make a difference? And how is this managed, and the public-private dimensions of it? And I just think both nationally and internationally, this is an inevitable conversation that I'm not quite sure we're ready for. Yeah. But I think the experience you've had, and if there's an area of precedent, it might be in the area of drugs.
Mm-hmm. And that was not an easy one to get to a positive place, because of course there's a lot of continued contentiousness about whether it's right to have the price of a drug be vastly different depending on which part of the world you're in. But it is right to have it different. I mean, look at, you mentioned HIV/AIDS, where we are at this point, with 20 million lives probably having been saved by the fact that we had the PEPFAR program to make it possible for very cheap antiretrovirals, 1 pill a day, to be offered to people who are HIV positive, and basically recognize that it's in all of our best interest. When we go back to the genome, we're all part of one family. We got to take care of our family, maybe especially those who have limited resources. You know, though, maybe, Richard, maybe that example was easier, although it was really hard to get to the right place, because it was about life and death. It was, you could imagine, this is something where if we don't do this, children and women and adults and old people, and they're all going to die because we didn't figure out a way to get them life-saving medicine. It's harder, I guess, when you're talking about a problem like climate change and some energy development that maybe will make the curve of global warming a little better than it otherwise would be. It's still really important, but it may be politically harder to make the case because it's harder to inspire people to break some China to get there, and it does require that.
Also, the other thing I thought Shirley was getting at, which I think is also part of the politics, nuclear is, I think, again, very helpful in the climate context, but as you were saying, what about nuclear waste? So people could agree, and then, but without, if you will, the tail. What do we do? Then you don't have a public policy answer. The technology alone doesn't give you the public policy answer.
That's exactly right. Mm-hmm. And because that dominated a lot of my time as chair of the NRC, and we never could settle on this question of a repository versus reprocessing the spent fuel because of what you would be separating out. So let's talk a little bit about research security, Francis. You know, the NIH helped us sound the alarm that some grant recipients were failing to disclose their ties to China. And we're using research collaborations and the peer review process to transfer discoveries and innovations funded by the American public to a competitor nation. But at the same time, you know, China has been perhaps the greatest international collaborator for the U.S. in science and engineering broadly writ, but even in the biomedical arena. And they're often seated when Chinese students come to this country to study. So how do we achieve the right balance in research security? Now, our own Department of Justice has kind of pulled back some on, what it's been doing. But are we where we need to be?
This has been an absolutely wrenching experience, President Jackson, for all of us who see our international colleagues as just critical parts of our scientific community. And certainly China, with its talent, many of which have come to our shores and have done amazing science, and oftentimes then stayed to greatly enrich our capabilities to lead the world. And yet, as the director of the NIH, I'm now going back maybe 4 or 5 years ago, seeing increasing evidence that the Chinese program called 1,000 Talents and others like that were reaching out and convincing, usually Chinese nationals, to accept a fair amount of financial support, sometimes the opportunity to set up an entire laboratory in China, and not having that disclosed to their own academic institutions, and not disclosed in grant applications being sent to NIH, which you're supposed to do. And I thought at first, well, this must just be a sloppy thing where one or two people forgot to mention this. But as it turned out, it was more than that. And how could you see that and not feel like there needs to be a response here? We all have to be honest with each other. We have to be fair and equitable about what kind of resources an investigator already has before you give them another $1 million in taxpayer money. So there was then a need to try to identify who in this big, amazing swath of hundreds of thousands of investigators that NIH supports might be in one of these situations. And it was pretty eye-opening, I gotta say, because some of the examples we uncovered were pretty egregious, and yet when we contacted the vice president of research at the relevant institution, they were totally unaware of it and often dismissive of it. I mean, we found people who were getting a full academic salary from their institution and getting about a 2/3 salary from a Chinese institution because they were mostly there. And it didn't seem like the university even quite knew that. So it did shine a light on the fact that there were some strange things going on. The bad part of this, though, and this is the heartbreaking part that we're still trying to figure out how best to try to really be clear about what happened, is that a lot of this was seen as really targeting particular scientists. This was xenophobia, because most of the instances, not all, there were a few in other countries as well, but most were individuals who were Chinese nationals. And hard-working, incredible, dedicated Chinese scientists began to feel like everybody's looking at them as if they're somehow not trustworthy anymore, and that's never should have happened. And we did everything we could to try to provide those sorts of reassurances, but I'm not sure it completely got accepted. It particularly turned out that a few of the instances that looked egregious turned out not to be, and those individuals rightly felt really badly treated and unjustly had their reputations damaged as a result. That's so awful and awkward. I think we've kind of gotten to the place now of having better system to recognize what's happened. And I think the word is now out there very clearly for the innocent people who just forgot to mention something, that they better be really clear about their other sources of support. But I gotta say, of the many painful experiences that I had in 12 years as NIH director, this is right up near the top of the list of where we had to come forward with painful information that I wished was not true, but it wouldn't be being a good steward of the public trust to just look the other way.
What can universities be doing better in that regard? As you said, many universities didn't even know this was going on.
That was sort of a shock. I think universities probably have a stronger responsibility than in a few instances we saw there to know what their faculty are doing and to actually, if somebody is spending 8 months a year in another country, to be aware of that and to be asking some questions about, now, wait a minute, why is this a good thing for our university when we're actually paying your yearly salary? I mean, it's funny that that was a revelation that had to happen at all, but it did. And I know universities are themselves beset by all sorts of other kinds of oversight. I'm fully aware of all the burdens that the government puts, but this doesn't feel like a particularly large burden to just know what your faculty are doing and where their support comes from.
Okay. So I think we can't get away from this issue of what kind of multilateral framework can work. In the aftermath of the breakup of the Soviet Union, as chair of the NRC, I was on what was called the Gore-Chernomyrdin Commission, and I'm sure you're aware of that. The U.S.-Russian Federation Commission on Scientific and Economic Cooperation is the real name. And the whole point was to work with Russia as well as the quote-unquote newly independent states, not only to look at things having to do with nuclear safety, with poorly controlled reactors, but also looking at nuclear materials and weapons. And as one of the outcomes of this, Ukraine actually gave up its nuclear weapons in exchange for security assurances from Russia, the US, and Great Britain. under what was called the Budapest Memorandum. So obviously we are now where we are with Ukraine. So, and then of course we have Finland and Sweden applying to be members of NATO, and Russia making certain rumbles about that. So how seriously should we take Russian threats of nuclear conflict? And then what kind of multilateral framework can have an effect here?
Three things. One is this war has been very bad for those who are worried about things nuclear. The fact, you talk about Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons and now has been invaded twice in 2014 and now is hardly an advertisement to give up nuclear weapons. The fact that Iraq under Saddam Hussein and Libya under Muammar Gaddafi gave up nuclear weapons, and then you had regime change in both countries, is hardly an advertisement to give up nuclear weapons. The fact that the president has repeatedly said the rationale for the United States not establishing a no-fly zone or putting forces directly on the ground in Ukraine is because, quote unquote, we don't want to start World War III. It will not come as a great surprise as a result that the lesson China will take from this is the best thing they can do if they ever intend to use force against Taiwan is dramatically build up their nuclear arsenal, because that would introduce caution into our decision-making when it comes to our willingness to help Taiwan. So I worry in many ways, and which gets me to your point, about the nuclear weapons we thought were in some ways behind us. We got through the Cold War, it stayed cold. There are 9 countries with nuclear weapons in the world right now. We thought that, not that it was solved, but this was a managed situation. And what's dangerous now is the value of nuclear weapons. The perception of the value, I think, is going up. And it doesn't take a great imagination to predict that potentially several countries in Asia, because of North Korea and China, and several countries, say in the Middle East, because of Iran, might be recalibrating their policies about eschewing nuclear weapons. So there's that. In terms of the Russian threat, I take it somewhat seriously, and the reason is, go back to, for me, the closest we ever came to nuclear war was when I was 11 years old, was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Nikita Khrushchev, at the time of the missile crisis, operated under considerably greater constraints and collective decision-making than Vladimir Putin does now. Vladimir Putin has essentially deinstitutionalized Russia. It's a kleptocracy. And I don't feel confident that if tomorrow he wanted to introduce nuclear weapons in one of many ways, he has a whole menu of options if he wanted to, into this crisis, that there's anyone who could and would stop him. That frightens me.
You mean from inside?
From inside. I'm not sure that mechanism, either institutional or individual, exists. Again, this whole war is, in many ways, Putin's war. And if he wanted to escalate with chemical or nuclear, maybe. And I think it raises it's a longer conversation, I won't go into it, but one of the questions we have to ask ourselves and have a conversation with President Zelensky of Ukraine, are there certain scenarios that would increase the likelihood that Mr. Putin might be tempted to look to use nuclear weapons? And are we certain that whatever benefits we would get, for example, from certain gains of territory are worth running that risk? For example, to retake Crimea by military force, to retake the entire Donbass. And I'm simply saying we need to think those through, because I do think a desperate Putin, unconstrained or at home, might be tempted to use nuclear weapons, and I can think of various scenarios. And the fact that we're having this conversation, I find slightly disquieting. I spent a lot of my early years in the career thinking about nuclear weapons effects, ran bomb calculator, all that circular error probability. I never thought I'd come back to it. I thought it'd send, like slide rules. I thought it had been essentially moved off center stage. And here we are talking about things, nuclear. I don't know if there's a multilateral response to that in the sense of Mr. Putin's calculus. The one other country I think that could possibly make a real difference would be China. And China has an incentive that nuclear weapons not become more commonplace, because China has to be careful that the Japans and Australias and South Koreas and Vietnams and others don't one day say, if they can't be confident of American security guarantees, they want to go nuclear. So I actually think China has a certain incentive here. So I could see diplomatically, now they've been reticent to weigh in, as best we know, publicly. I don't know what they're doing privately. We can try to fashion certain things with Mr. Putin. There's also deterrence still works here. And there's certain deterrent threats or promises I could communicate if I were in the US government to a Vladimir Putin saying, if you were to use nuclear weapons in this fashion, you should know. Here's what we are prepared to do in response, and you would be worse off as a result. So again, I think it still remains, as a result, highly unlikely that nuclear weapons are introduced. But again, the conversation, both in terms of this crisis, is more than I would have thought. And I think for the next era of international relations, I think nuclear weapons potentially play a more prominent role. Proliferation becomes a more imaginable phenomena than I would have thought as even 1 or 2 years ago.
Well, it's probably time to move away just from the nuclear, but it's an interesting perspective because you're balancing what can have a salutary effect relative to climate, and one that across a broader set of political beliefs, people are coming to feel it may have a role. However, nuclear has never been able to be divorced from the question of weapons development. And one could argue that nations want the nuclear power for legitimate reasons, but it also happens to give them, you could call it a standby capability to move down the pathway.
100% right. That tension
Weapons development.
is in the text of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
It is.
It's an attempt to square the circle. You should be free to, indeed, we're on the hook to help countries develop nuclear, as you know, nuclear power for energy generation purposes. At the same time, we're all on the hook to stop not just horizontal proliferation, but to bring down our own vertical proliferation. And shall we say there's some tension in the various clauses of the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
I know, because they cause a little heartbreak and heartache here. So let's talk a little bit about, you mentioned the utility and the benefit of some of these newer technologies we have. But we know that they've also seeded and created platforms for, misinformation and disinformation and the propagation thereof. So Francis, could you give us a little perspective on, that whole issue of misinformation and disinformation, and how you tried to counter it during the worst phases of the pandemic? And here's something that has always occurred to me. We've talked about the efficacy of vaccines, right? And a lot of people have in their minds that if you get COVID, the vaccine is a failure. Because, you know more about immunology than I'll ever know, but I don't think people understand what I'll call defense in depth, right? And your early soldiers, your killer troops, and your later soldiers. That's how I think about them. But can you talk a little bit about how you tried to combat that, and what can we do in terms of being, prepared and not having such a vulnerability for the next pandemic, if that's possible?
This is a source of deep concern that it has been, especially for the last year or so, a case where the disinformation and the misinformation continues to expand its reach, and the facts seem to be continually pushed aside. Part of the challenge is, of course, that the science changes over time. I don't know if we did a good job at the beginning of the pandemic when public health recommendations were being put out to say, this is the best we've got right now. The information we know right now says this is what you should do about social distancing or wearing a mask or getting a vaccine. But it might change because we're going to learn more about this virus. And as we found out, the virus changed itself into multiple different variants that had very different behaviors, almost like we started over again when Omicron came along. And somehow when then we came forward, people like me, like Tony Fauci, who labored at this and continues to on a daily basis, trying to share truthful information. If it changed, then the answer was, oh, you're flip-flopping, you're manipulating us, as opposed to this is new information. If you went to your stockbroker a month ago and said, tell me something that I might want to invest in, and they gave you an answer, you'd notice that. And then if you came back today and asked the same question, and they gave you the same answer, you'd go, you're not a very good stockbroker, you're not watching the market. But somehow with science and public health, that didn't seem to apply. It was like, you changed your opinion from what you told us a month or two ago. And that means you don't know what you're doing. In fact, it was usually because there was new information, new facts. But it got a lot of things into a twist. And then on top of that, frankly, the whole overlay of the divisiveness, the vitriol in social media, the politicization of things that never should have been political, made it almost impossible to figure out how to get information across to people who had already decided they distrusted the government. You can look and say, okay, what is the strongest predictor of who is not going to get vaccinated? It's political party. And what is the demographic of the group that's least likely to get vaccinated? It's white evangelicals. I'm a white evangelical. This really bothers me. This is supposed to be a faith that talks about truth, the truth that will set you free. And yet that particular community has particularly gotten, I think, caught up in all the conspiracies and the political messages that are, it seems like me, 180 degrees away from the principles of the faith. But it's just a reflection of how our society has gotten so tangled up in such a destructive place. So how do we do that? I mean, this is a lesson I'd love to figure out. And I think we need to do an audit of the public communication about COVID and say what things worked and what things didn't. I frankly think from my own perspective, having been in front of CNN and Fox News and everything else more times than I can count, I wish I had told more stories and used less statistics. Not that stories are actually reliable if they're just anecdotes that are outlying events that didn't really happen very often, but a story that kind of teaches you something that's right in the middle of the point you're trying to make, many times lands in the human psyche a lot more effective than telling you what the latest estimate of R0 is, or in how many, what was the percentage of people who got vaccinated who got sick. So we need to figure out a way to do that better. And we need to convince people that we are really, in circumstances like this, trying to convey the best information, knowing that it might have to change because it probably will. Now, a lot of things I wish we had done different in retrospect, but I hope people will see this as having tried to do the best you can in a very fast-moving, difficult space. There's a group called Braver Angels that I've been working with, which puts me in a circumstance, this happened actually just 2 nights ago, where I get on a Zoom call with 6 or 7 people who are very angry about the public health response to COVID, most of whom are very far in the rightward direction as far as their politics. And I have to listen to them about why it is that they lost trust in the government. And then they have to sort of listen to me about why I'm disappointed in the way the public responded. But then we each have to say, what mistakes did we make? There's something about that that's really helpful. And at the end of 2 hours, what is the thing that people walk away with? Every time I've done this, it's just several times, it's, you know, we're not that far apart after all. Now that I've had a chance to really have this interaction, if we could take that kind of thing and scale it to 300 million people, maybe we'd have a chance of figuring out how to get back to the point where we recognize we really have the same values. We just have all this stuff layered on top of it that gets in the way.
So Richard, how sustainable is repression of the free flow of information given where we are in the 21st century? You know, and that free flow of information can be for good or ill. You know, what are your perspectives about, you know, our being, you know, can such repression exist, and can we police hate speech? And those are 2 different questions.
Right. There's an international and a national dimension.
Right.
Internationally, when the new technologies gradually emerged, there was a lot of optimism that the free flow of information would be a force for good. The Arab Spring, when it began, the fact that it was called the Arab Spring, there was optimism that it would, and then what we saw in the Arab world and what we've seen with the Great Firewall of China, we now see in Russia, is that authoritarian regimes have gotten the upper hand. And they can monitor certain communications or they can just shut them down. But either way, illiberalism in some ways is gaining over liberalism internationally. And we have as you know, I'm at the Council on Foreign Relations, former board member here. We have a task force, basically a commission coming out in a few weeks on cyber. And on this question, essentially, the idea of the previous administration, I think it was the Clinton administration that first articulated the idea of a global open internet. Basically, the task force is going to say it's time to give up on that. There just isn't a political consensus in the world, and what we need to do again is create networks of the like-minded, and that's the best we can do. And again, it's not a universal multilateralism; it's a more selective multilateralism, and hopefully you can demonstrate that if you adhere to certain principles, your economies, your societies will benefit from it, and then the example we set will ideally create a little bit of competition or dissent in these other worlds. And I think that's probably the most, but in this sense, Orwell was probably closer to the truth than we would have liked in terms of internationally. I think domestically, I'm thinking about this a lot. My next book, of all things, is about American democracy, which is not a book that normally someone who works on international relations would write, but I've come to the conclusion that the biggest threat to our status and position in the world is not China or Russia, but it's ourselves. And I'm thinking hard about social media, which the more I researched it, the more seriously I take it as a problem. And I think COVID was particularly bad because we didn't have normal communities. We were living decentralized, didn't have normal workspace or school or social interactions, so online communities took their place. And online communities, in many cases, and they're unedited, if you will. There's no gatekeepers. They're very like-minded. They can easily become extremist, divorced from facts, and other things. The problem is regulation is really tough. And when you look at what Twitter's tried to do, the idea that people who are working at these places are going to set the ground rules for the American democracy, very tough to imagine that going well. You then will have also alternative companies out there. Yeah. So even if you deny access to one, 20 more will spring up. I think there are certain ground rules you could set up. For example, I don't like the idea that you have anonymity, that people can be online in ways that it's not clear who they are. I think that's a dangerous thing. So I think there are questions about also the responsibility of the companies for content, the Section 230, Congressman's here, that whole issue. My guess is right now social media is under-regulated. I can say that. Where I get uncomfortable is saying what's the Goldilocks solution? Given free speech, and what's the correct level of regulation? That's a tough one, and something you said before, and Francis said, it's particularly hard because it's a moving target. Yeah. The technology is changing so fast. So I actually, at the end of the day, I'm not confident that there's a technology or even a regulatory solution. I come out, there may have to be more of an educational, yes. That the society, we have to make ourselves less vulnerable to it, as opposed to thinking we can solve it through regulation or technology.
I actually agree with you about the educational piece, but that's the premise of, in fact, our being a residentially based university, even as we are a technological one, because that education, I think, comes from bringing people together, just as you talked about the group that you're part of. You have to get people to interact and talk. But let me ask you a quick follow-on question, Richard. So you really get to see this. How does our political and social polarization play in the international realm? How does it affect us and our standing in the world?
It affects us in a couple of ways, none of them good. Sorry to be the bad news bear. I think
I
Francis,
knew that was going to be the answer.
Francis has gotten the preponderance of optimism. I'm the preponderance of pessimism here. Our polarization, it affects us in a couple of ways. One is for those who depend on us, it makes their choice to depend on us look risky.
Yeah.
If we can have major changes in policy, lots of countries that have depended on us, essentially now they hedge. They don't, look at 2024. They don't know what the results are going to be. They don't know what policies. And whereas 50 or 100 years ago, when you had rotations of power, if I can use a sports analogy, the policy differences were, say, within the 40-yard lines on the football field around. Now they're going to the end zones. And if you're dependent on the United States, that's a frightening proposition. The most common question I get asked, I get a lot of international visitors. The single most common question I've been asked over the last few years is what's the norm and what's the aberration for the United States?
That's good.
And people want to, and they need to set their thinking
That's a good question.
accordingly. The other ways it hurts us, besides our unpredictability, which affects the confidence of allies, the example we set. I often think the most important thing we do to promote democracy is not bang people on the head saying you ought to become more democratic. It's we show that democracy is the most successful system, and it goes hand in hand with successful economies and successful innovation. When we show that democracies work, the rest of the world begins to say, why can't we have a little bit more of that? And then the opposite is also true. It drove me crazy after January 6th when Chinese television showed pictures of what was going on to justify their repression.
Yeah.
They said, this is what happens when you have a democracy. It's the same thing as chaos. And they were using it to justify their own heavy hand. So I actually think, when we began the conversation, what happens in Wuhan doesn't stay in Wuhan. Well, what happens here in Washington and around this country doesn't stay here either. In that sense, there is a bit of a global village, as Mr. McLuhan once pointed out.
Since you suggested that Francis is the optimist, and I agree with you, let's talk a bit about healing divides. And let me talk in two areas. Our national politics, have become so polarized that, they have veered into violence, including the January 6th insurrection and death threats against a man who's devoted his life to helping people, namely Dr. Anthony Fauci, your colleague, the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. And so that's one element of it. The other is, even in calmer times, there have been troubling racial and ethnic disparities in health outcomes in the U.S., and the pandemic only increased them, with African Americans, Hispanics, Native Americans being disproportionately affected. So healing those divides, extends as well in the healthcare arena, having to do with eliminating some of these disparities. Tell me how you think about, from your perspective in your world, how we go about bridging those things.
Well, that's an absolutely critical part of what healthcare needs to be able to succeed at, and clearly has not so far. I think for all of us who maybe had kind of looked the other way about health disparities in this country, COVID shone a bright light on just how dramatically the difference can be in terms of what happens to somebody who gets infected with this virus. The hospitalization rates and the death rates for African Americans and Hispanics were 2 to 3-fold higher, Native Americans even higher in the pre-vaccine era during 2020. And that had nothing to do with the immune systems of those individuals. That had to do with whether they were able to stay safe, or whether forced to be in a circumstance with lots of other people in crowded spaces, or needing to go to work, and then encountering a healthcare system that oftentimes turned them away when they needed that kind of assistance. So let no one look at that and say, we have arrived in this country at an equitable healthcare system. We have not. And of course, right in the middle of that, the killing of George Floyd, bringing into sharp relief the fact that our social fabric is also deeply affected by the long-term 400 years of racism became clear as well. And that was troubling, to put it mildly, to some of us who probably had been a bit too complacent about all of this, but it was a wake-up call. I do think that wake-up call is being responded to in healthcare, certainly in terms of what we were able to do at the National Institutes of Health by turning this into a moment of action, not just a moment of hand-wringing, by revamping really our health disparities research agenda, which had been accused, maybe somewhat rightly, of admiring the problem as opposed to trying to do something about it. That has now turned into a much more action-oriented kind of enterprise. What interventions could actually change this? And likewise, the deficiency in our workforce of people of color, which has been there for a long time, is no longer being seen as, well, it's just too hard. It is not too hard. We can figure out how to solve this with dedication on the parts of everybody, and a Unite initiative that we started has really gathered a lot of momentum there. So yeah, really sobering, distressing information. If it motivates you to do something, then it's a good thing we have seen it. But we have a long history here. Shirley, you and I were in the same program with Skip Gates talking about finding your roots. And in that program, I learned for the first time that my namesake, Francis Sellers, the first ancestor of mine who came to the US, was quite successful in his own way, gaining property in the eastern shore of Maryland, and he was a slave owner. My ancestors enslaved your ancestors, so we can say that quite clearly now on the basis of history. And yet, we have to figure out how to get to the point where your current circumstance and everybody else in this country is not carried forward because of that history lingering on. And I think healthcare is a place where we have the opportunity to fix this. We have metrics to know whether we fixed it, and we should not rest until we figured out that path forward.
You know, Richard, this is right. Richard, you played a real role in brokering peace in Northern Ireland. Are there lessons that we can take away from that that may play into what Francis just talked about, or the broader issue of bridging divides?
What proved pivotal in bringing peace to Northern Ireland after 3 decades of troubles that took something like 3,600 lives was a couple of things. One was there was a security presence, and people had to understand that they could not shoot their way to power. You had to shut down illegitimate pathways. You had to show that violence wouldn't pay. Indeed, violence would be counterproductive. And that was essential, and that to me was one side of the coin. The other side of the coin, though, is you had to show that politics and compromise could yield dividends. Maybe not everything, but could bring about a reality that was both better than the status quo and better than what you'd get if you used violence. And that's where my predecessor in the job, George Mitchell, in particular, deserved great credit. George brokering what became the Good Friday agreement. And it showed what diplomacy could accomplish. And that, to me, is in part what I would say, and some other things factored in as well. There was a degree of exhaustion. People, saw what they paid. Everybody paid a collective price for the violence. So situations, to use my favorite word in negotiations, ripen. And then you need one other thing. When situations lend themselves to diplomacy, you have to have leaders present who are willing and able to make big decisions. And one of the reasons I'm not wildly optimistic about a breakthrough in Ukraine and Russia right now is that we have leaders who could, if Mr. Putin wanted to, make big decisions, but I don't think he's likely to. So you need leaders who are so inclined. But I think domestically it points out the need to eliminate violence as a tool of politics. You need to show, though, that politics can work, so we need to think about what reforms we might want to introduce in order so people aren't alienated from, quote unquote, the system. We want people to become insiders. We want them to use existing iPad. They need to feel that there's some chance of progress. Those, to me, are the lessons. It's slow, it's difficult, and it's always imperfect. So again, I don't. There's no solutions here. To go back to what we were kidding about a few minutes ago, this is a project. This is a more perfect union.
Right.
Our unfinished work, to use Lincoln. This is our unfinished work, and I think. But it gets back to one other thing. But if I could do one thing, I would transform civics education in the United States. I would want every person leaving a high school or a college campus to understand the basics of American democracy, to be exposed to the critical documents. I want people to understand the behaviors that are central, the civility, the nonviolence, other behaviors that are central. And I also want them to learn to cherish it, that for all the flaws, for all the imperfections and the rest, it still racks up pretty well compared to the alternatives. And so before we toss it over, I want people to understand its value.
So you started, I thought, in religion, or had,
No.
and can you tell us a little bit about from there to where you are now?
I did start. So I went to Oberlin 400 years ago. And when I got there, I didn't quite know what I wanted to study. And I went around, I said, I think it's a good question for a student to ask when he or she goes to any campus. I said, who's the best professor? And someone said, it's Professor Thomas Frank. And I said, okay, what does he teach? And they said, he teaches New Testament. And I said, well, that's interesting. We never got around to reading that one in my house. But I'm game. And I actually feel I'm sitting next to two fantastic teachers here. I feel really fortunate from what I've experienced here. Great teachers. You can be talking about lipids, and you can make it really interesting. It doesn't matter. Great, and that's what this professor did too. So I got interested in religion. He said, you're kind of interested in things. Why don't you come with me to the Middle East? We'll do an archaeological dig. I said, okay. And then stayed, and I spent my junior year abroad traveling around the Middle East and in Israel learning about it. And I said, well, I don't want to look at broken pottery for the next 50 years. I don't think I'm meant to be an archaeologist, but I am kind of interested in this part of the world. So from religion, I got into Middle Eastern studies. From Middle Eastern studies, I got into international relations. But I am intrigued about the power of religion in the field in several ways. One, we talked before about wars of necessity, wars of choice. That's just war thinking. So much, religion gives you such a moral, ethical, but also policy framework. We don't think of religion providing policy frameworks. Religion actually, and this is in the tradition of the great Christian thinkers as well as Jewish thinkers, offers a real set of yardsticks for how to think about the use of force, both when to use it as well as how to use it. So religion provides that, but also analytically, I've spent several times in my career, I was given considerable authority, responsibility is a better word, for dealing with Afghanistan. Well, there was no way you could get involved in Afghanistan and not have some appreciation for the role of religion and culture in driving societies and in influencing everything from their politics to their military behavior. So it turns out that religion is one of the really valuable analytical tools for coming up with an accurate picture. Indeed, if you're thinking about the United States, the fact that over the last 10 or 15 years, we've actually become less religious as a society, the growing secularization of the United States, is a really interesting subject and has all sorts of implications for what's going on in our society. So I find religion, as a result, it's useful as a framework, and it's useful as in order to understand what ultimately drives human behavior. Last but not least, in places like Northern Ireland, religion is identity. Just to give you one small thing. In Northern Ireland, when people speak of integrated education, they don't mean black and white. They mean Catholics and Protestants going to the same school. religion is fundamentally tied to identity in Northern Ireland. So there's no way you can begin to make inroads politically unless you have some appreciation for the role of religion in that society.
So Francis, I think you have said that you were in medical school when you became a man of faith. And from what I hear, what faith is, it gives you a certain grounding in your perspective about humans, the value of human life, what you do. How did it play into how you have pursued your career?
Well, we didn't read the New Testament in my house growing up either. My family was not really that interested in religious traditions. They were interested in theater and music and educating their 4 boys to keep them out of the public schools, which was quite successful for a while until I ultimately learned about science in a 10th grade chemistry class. But I had no interest in religious issues at all. I was an atheist as a graduate student studying quantum mechanics at Yale. But then I went to medical school and encountered the reality of life and death situations on a daily basis with good people who were facing the end of their lives from terrible diseases that, frankly, our medical efforts were not going to do that much to help them. And yet many of them seemed to be at peace about that based upon their faith. And I imagined myself in that situation and did not think I would be at peace. And I had to understand, what is it that this is all about? I assume this is a psychological crutch, but it's a pretty strong one. So I figured if I'm going to be an atheist, I've got to know what I'm doing here, because I haven't really done my homework. I'm a scientist. I'm supposed to study things before making a decision. And began to explore what it is that people believe and why they think it's rational to do so. And discovered to my surprise that it's incredibly rational if you come at it from the perspective of trying to answer questions that science doesn't really help you with, but what you think need to be answered. And I began to realize, as Chesterton said, that atheism is probably the least supportable of the options. He said it's the most daring of all dogmas because it's the assertion of a universal negative. Scientists aren't supposed to assert universal negatives. So, okay, I get that. And agnosticism was where I landed for a little bit. But ultimately, actually out of science itself, about appreciating the need for an understanding of what happened before the Big Bang, and why is there something instead of nothing, and why do those beautiful laws that you all study here in this remarkable institution that have elegant mathematical formulations that are actually beautiful, why is that the way that nature works? And why do those constants that determine how those laws actually play out in reality, that you can't determine the value of a priori, you just have to measure them, like the strong and weak nuclear forces or the speed of light. And if you change their value by just the tiniest amount, you don't end up with a universe that's interesting at all. You end up with particles that never quite coalesce, or they coalesce way too soon. We live on this incredible knife edge of improbability. And either you have to believe in multiverses and we're just to be lucky in one that had the right parameters, which is quite a leap of faith, or you have to consider the possibility that there's an intelligence behind all of this. Oh my. But then it was morality that ultimately drew me from a deist perspective, which is what I just described, and was sort of Einstein's sense that, yeah, there's an intelligence out there. But morality seems to imply that intelligence cares about right and wrong, which means we should care about right and wrong, and that intelligence must care about us. And that led me, over kicking and screaming a couple of years, to recognize that I really wanted, more than anything, to become a person of faith. I could no longer resist it, and have been so since I was 27. And I found that enormously satisfying. People told me, your head is going to explode. Collins, you're studying DNA and you're going to become a Christian. Don't you realize those are incompatible? It's all wrong. It's not wrong at all. Our culture has managed to twist the words of some verses of the Bible, particularly Genesis 1 and 2, to suggest that those are books of science that need to be interpreted in literal ways, which was never clearly the intention when those words were first read by the first audience. But if you want to basically look with much more wide open eyes at both what science teaches you about nature and what you can learn from faith about who God is and who we are, it's wonderfully synthetic and harmonious. And I've never really encountered a collision between those. And to basically dismiss questions like, why am I here? And is there a God? And what's the meaning of life? Because they're not scientific questions, because they sort of aren't. I want to ask those questions. And faith gives me a window into that. And it's also, for me, a source of comfort when things are going wrong. And plenty of things have been going wrong. And if I start my day in the space of thinking about what my faith can teach me about struggles and what comes from them, and maybe there is a meaning for suffering, even though it's horrible to watch, that gets me along in a place that I otherwise, I think, would have a lot more trouble.
Can I say two other things quickly?
Sure, please.
Listening to Francis stimulated two other thoughts from my own tradition, which is Judaism. One is the Sabbath. Like everybody here, I find the life intense. The amount of work we do, how fast-paced we are, and in some ways, because of modern technology, it's harder and harder to escape.
Yeah.
I look forward to Friday nights, to literally unplugging a bit, and I find the idea of and I'm not strictly observant, but I find the idea of getting off the merry-go-round an incredible, just incredibly useful and welcome respite. And something that I recommend, whether there's a religious element or not. I think there is something to be said for that. The other is the holiest day of the year in Judaism is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And there's a prayer that we all recite, and it's one that I constantly come back to in public policy. It's and where you list all the sins of commission, all the bad things you've done, and it's a long list, being human. But what's so interesting is there's 30 or 40 of them. And then the last one is the sin of omission. It's when you stood around, and the translation's a little bit hard, like with a confused heart. It's an uncertainty, and you were immobilized when you should have acted. And it's something I constantly come back to, particularly when I was in government. When you'd be faced with a tough situation, and it's too easy to go through options 1, 2, and 3, and they're all, none's attractive. And you basically say, okay, well, let's kick it down. We'll come back to this. We'll have another interagency meeting in a week or two. And it's important to keep in mind that the decision not to act and not to decide is every bit as consequential as choosing an imperfect option. Indeed, those imperfect options in many ways could be less imperfect than the option of doing nothing. And I just find it a very useful thing to circle back to.
Wonderful.
Well, I always learned that faith is the substance of things longed for, the evidence of things not seen.
That's from the Hebrews.
And I think it's an important statement, and at least for me, because it means that, not everything is understandable in an analytic way. And so with that, I hope you understand these two honorands a little better. And thank them. So tomorrow, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute will award honorary doctorates to Ambassador Richard Haas and to the Honorable Francis Collins. And now you understand why. Thank you all.